Okay, everybody, thanks for being here. I'm Ben Freeman. I'm the policy director at Defense Priorities. We're here to talk today about the Global Posture Review, this review document that the Biden administration announced back in February that they were undertaking to look at U.S. global basing posture around the world. We have a good panel for you. I think that you'll hear about in a minute. The review was supposed to come out in the summer. It was delayed and then just released sort of suddenly after the long delay 2 weeks ago, I think, with just or a week and a half ago, with just a one-page press release and statements to the press that there hadn't really been any major changes made by the review, and that any kind of major changes would await strategy documents, which are underway. So I think it's fair to say that the Global Posture Review, disappointingly for those of us who were planning events and wrote papers about it, like Gil Barndollar, who wrote a paper for Defense Priorities on the process, it's fair to say it was a bit of a disappointment. But that's not going to stop us, I think, from having a good discussion about not necessarily the document, but about, or lack thereof, but about basing, and maybe about why reviews like this are so wedded, and strategy reviews that are supposed to guide them remain so wedded to the sort of strategic status quo that we've had in the United States for a long time. Why, in a world with fairly different weapon systems and geopolitics, the U.S. basing structure it's certainly not totally static, but why it doesn't change more. And we can talk about what the United States is up to in the world, or should be, with its basing policy. So here to introduce our panel and guide our discussion, we have Katrina Mulligan, who is the U.S. Foreign Policy and Defense Correspondent for the Financial Times. So Katrina, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Ben. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. You're going to have to trust in me to ask the questions on this one, but I'm looking forward to it. And I'd just like to introduce you to our three panelists. We have three guests today. First up is Gil Barndollar. He is a senior fellow at Defense Priorities, who of course is convening today's meeting. He's also senior research fellow at the Catholic University of America's Center for the Study of Statesmanship. And he previously served as an infantry officer with the Marine Corps, and he's been to Afghanistan twice with them. We also have Stacy Pettyjohn. She is director of the defense program at the Center for a New American Security, that's CNAS, and she was previously at RAND, and she looks at all the kinds of things that we'll be discussing today: defense strategy, posture, force planning, and does wargaming as well. And finally, we have Eugene Gold. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you've come straight from another meeting. Eugene is coined the term restraint as a proposed grand strategy for the US. So it will be very interesting to hear what he makes of this recent review. He's associate professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame, and he's also, I think, a visiting fellow at Defense Priorities as well. I'm going to structure this so we'll hear from Gil, then Stacy, then Eugene with a few of their opening remarks, and then we'll set them all head to head. I should warn you all, I'm not sure that there will be any ardent defenders of the Global Posture Review among our guests, but let's see. But I know they all bring very different perspectives. And of course, we can try and check what they say against what the administration has claimed for this review. Let me just start, before I hand to you, Gil, by just reminding ourselves of what President Joe Biden said in early February when he actually announced this review. He announced this DOD-led review at the Department of State, which might in itself be a clue as to the kind of direction the administration wanted to take. He said, "Today, I'm announcing additional steps to course correct our foreign policy and better unite our democratic values with our diplomatic leadership. To begin, Defense Secretary Austin will be leading a global posture review of our forces so that our military footprint is appropriately aligned with our foreign policy and national security priorities." So, Gil, what's your take on that? Did the president achieve that with his review?
Yeah, I think it really was business as usual, and Ben referred to the disappointment among folks that have followed this closely, the handful of us. But yeah, it was very much DoD grading its own work and giving itself an A. And it's funny in that this was a document of review that it was elective, right? This isn't like the Quadrennial Defense Review or the National Defense Strategy, or things that are mandated. They're part of the regular rhythm or legally mandated by the Defense Department, by the National Security Establishment. So this was elective. I think the last one I'm aware of, somebody can correct me if there's one I missed, but as far as I know, the last time this was done was 2004 during the Bush administration, and that was again, kind of ratified just what they wanted to do and what their vision for foreign and defense policy was. But that was at least, I think, a 15 to 20 page document that was publicly released. So the fact that when this was announced in February, this was tasked to the Defense Department and to Secretary Austin. This didn't have to happen. This was sort of an elective choice, and that's what I think made it interesting to some of us watching it and seeing this come up, and maybe raise some hopes that would be a more substantive document, a more substantive review, and a promise of some real potential reforms to the U.S. The really expansive and enormous U.S. Global military footprint. So, with that all being said, it also offered an opportunity to, as Mark Carlin said yesterday at CNAS, to provide a baseline or kind of a zero budgeting sort of a look at okay, where are we? What are we doing? I mean, again, the U.S. global posture is so expansive and has been that way for a long time that this was an opportunity to kind of put everything in one place and look that over. The other thing that I think a lot of watchers have brought up in the immediate wake of this being released, and maybe a little bit at the outset, is that the timing of this is a little funny in the sense that this is still, we're now just about a year into the administration, but usually the strategy should inform the posture, right? And we're essentially running on the 2018 National Defense Strategy, and the Biden team is getting ready, is working presumably on the next one, which is coming out next year. But it would make more sense, it'd be more logical that you would release the new National Defense Strategy, and then the posture review would ensure that the U.S. global military footprint is aligned with that strategy. And I think Stacy's got some thoughts on this, and I don't want to step on her toes. But the why behind doing this, when it was done and the way it was done, is kind of curious. So all that being said, I think DoD graded itself and is essentially, as I said, gave itself an A or maybe an A-, pretty minor from the very limited release. The kind of one-page press release and some statements by senior defense officials in the wake of this. We're looking at kind of tweaking around the edges, some putting a helicopter squadron in Korea, an artillery divisional headquarters, minor kind of reversal of some of the limited and kind of belated Trump withdrawal stuff in Germany, infrastructure in Guam. I mean, pretty limited changes coming out of this, obviously, and it was quickly endorsed by the president and on from there. So I think this is certainly a missed opportunity. I understand this was probably not the best vehicle. Leaving aside the timing and the sequencing of it, you're not going to make enormous global changes off a specifically a DoD review. And given the consultation with allies and the amount of time and effort needed to get access to some of these countries, someplace where the U.S. has had a substantial military footprint for a long time, and then the infrastructure and the amount of money that goes into this. But we have, on the other hand, we have seen the administration make some moves both before and during this process in terms of rebalancing a little bit in the Middle East. The pullouts of a lot of missile defense assets and reshuffling of things to Jordan. So on the one hand, there's I think a lack. I think what strikes a lot of people, especially people that are probably more focused or maybe completely focused on the Pacific and on the threat of China, or the potential threat of China, is the lack of urgency that seems to be a piece of this. That there is, as I said, business as usual, some tweaks on the margins, a lot of talk. I think healthy in terms of recoupling with allies and getting away from some of the unilateralism and some of the way the Trump administration did business. So I think that's all to the good. But to my mind, this was certainly a missed opportunity, and it's interesting to kind of read the tea leaves about what this says about where the Biden administration is heading and what its overall vision is, and how much this accords with, I think, a lot of different kind of slogans or taglines, and to some extent plans, whether you want to talk about a kind of global alliance of democracies against autocracies, whether you want to talk about a foreign policy for the middle class, or just a general kind of belated and emerging reticence to use American force. We've used it for the last 15 to 20 years, or certainly the first decade of this century. So I think I'll leave it there, but I guess that the tagline we went with this event, refusing to choose, is still sort of the thing that's uppermost in my mind as we now sit here in the wake of this limited release of the Global Posture Review. And it does, to me, speak to, at least at this stage of the game, a refusal to make hard choices in a world where obviously American power is we're certainly no longer a hyperpower, although still the preeminent military and economic power in the world. But that is ebbed substantially, and our commitments, I think, outpace our resources far more than they did even 10, let alone 20 years ago. So I think refusing to make hard choices is what concerns me the most.
Thanks, Gil. Stacy, let's go over to you. And of course, we'd like to hear, do you also see it as a missed opportunity and a refusal to choose?
Thanks, Katrina. Yes, I do. I agree with a lot of what Gil said. He raised the 2004 posture review as a contrast to today. And there have been a lot of intervening posture reviews, but those are the two ones that have gotten the most attention. And when you look at 2004, there was a lot of fanfare with that announcement because they made a lot of changes. And there was an emphasis and an attempt to rely on cold bases and temporary presence instead of big, large facilities like the United States had during the Cold War. By contrast, today, you see that there seems to have been a missed opportunity and unmet expectations for more change from this posture review. But I think that's because it wasn't well understood what this was intended to do. My impression and my reading of this, and you relaying President Biden's remarks initially when he announced it, confirmed what I think to be true, which is that this was corrective. This was intended to reverse some of the decisions that have been made pretty abruptly and unilaterally by the Trump administration in terms of capping and withdrawing some forces from Germany, and some of the relationships with key allies and host nations, such as Japan and South Korea, which had been strained under President Trump, who was demanding that these nations pay more for the presence of U.S. forces when they are actually there as part of a security guarantee and commitment that the two countries have to each other. So I think the administration made a bit of a mistake by raising expectations and making a big deal about this, but it was really intended to assure our allies and partners that they have a systematic process, that they're going to consult with them, and that they're not going to just be willy-nilly changing the posture based on the whims of the president every day. That being said, I do agree with Gil that this was a missed opportunity. I don't know if it necessarily means that the administration is not going to make hard choices, since they still are completing the next defense strategy. But they have emphasized continually, Secretary Austin included at the Reagan Forum this past weekend, that China is the pacing challenge. And it has long been known that the U.S.'s military presence in the Indo-Pacific is not sufficient and is actually quite vulnerable. It doesn't mean you actually need more bases with people permanently at them, but that you need to take steps to increase the survivability of the forces that are there, which could be distributing across other bases, perhaps implementing concrete steps that were initially agreed with the Philippines in 2014 with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or maybe capitalizing on the AUKUS agreement with Australians, which has promised that American bomber and fighter aircraft will begin to rotate there. But that has been a part of the discussions among Canberra and Washington for a long time. So I would have liked to have seen some steps that would have shored up the military balance in the Indo-Pacific and shown that the U.S. Department of Defense is taking seriously the fact that China has a large arsenal of long-range conventional missiles that could hold at risk U.S. forces in the area. I also think there was a missed opportunity in the Middle East. They explicitly stated that the posture review was not about Afghanistan. And one of the big remaining questions there is, what is the over-the-horizon presence for counterterrorism presence for Afghanistan going to look like? They did take steps and remove, before the review was announced, which Dr. Carlin yesterday said was a part of the process, to pull out some of the air defenses that have been in the Middle East for a while, because those are assets that are that we have relatively few of, and they're in incredibly high demand across all of the theaters that the U.S. military operates in. But overall, I would have liked to have seen more forward progress in the Indo-Pacific. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Stacey, and we'll come to Eugene now. Do you see this as a missed opportunity for failing to lean forwards into the Indo-Pacific, or do you see it in some other way?
Well, I certainly don't see it as a missed opportunity for failing to lean forward into the Indo-Pacific, because I think leaning forward into the Indo-Pacific is a bad idea. If you were a hawk, you would see it as a missed opportunity to do that. And but I don't know. I'm not a hawk, so it strikes me that the key points about the Global Posture Review have already been made. Gil said is right that it seems logical that it should follow, not precede, the strategy conversation. A bunch of the big comments that both Gil and Stacy made are strategy comments, not more than posture comments about what we should do in the Middle East with counterterrorism, or in the Indo-Pacific with deterring China. It strikes me that under the current strategy, which is basically a holdover of the Trump strategy of more great power competition, plus the substantial commitment in the Biden administration to allies, right? So Trump was sort of a more unilateral confront China guy, and now we have let's be very close to allies and confront China. Kind of maybe Russia also a little bit. But, if you're serious about that, there are real posture conversations to be had just to implement that strategy. And it is striking that, the department sort of, is, I like Gil's phrasing, gave itself an A for what it's done, which doesn't seem obvious to me. If you were, really serious about confronting China, you might, there is this ongoing debate about whether we should be less ambiguous about Taiwan, and if we're really committed to confronting China. Well, you could change the posture and confront China much more aggressively if you wanted. I don't think it would be a good idea. You could also, what I hope is that the Global Posture Review has given us a list of, here's what we think each component of our posture is achieving, such that if we were to change our strategy, which I hope we would, I hope we moved in the direction of restraint, which, some co-authors and I, kind of first wrote about years ago, that we would be ready. We would be able to look down the list and see, given the new strategy, is this important? No, let's get rid of that piece of the posture. It would just make a much more rapid adjustment to the new strategy later if they've sort of prepared. So I don't think they did carry through on the Global Posture Review, given what the strategy is, because I don't think the administration was confident that they wanted to do that yet. What they wanted is to, I think, what Stacy said makes sense. Course correct a little bit on a few things that they knew they were committed to with respect to allies, and they're trying to figure out what else they're committed to, and then just be ready to go down the list and make posture adjustments later. I think Stacy's point about distributed forces and as opposed to big fixed bases, this is another important part of thinking about posture and adapting it to kind of the new realities of potential adversaries of the United States having precision strike capabilities. And, I was disappointed that was essentially not mentioned in the one pager. They could have at least talked about that. But, that is a logical way forward. I think that my main point about strategy and how the posture might follow from it, if you're committed to allies, which the administration is much more than I am, but I think we should have allies. Allies are not a tragic thing inherently. But if you're committed to allies, that strategy question doesn't answer the posture question by itself. You have to think about the posture to fit with that. So we could have alliances, and the role of the United States could be to provide a backstop. The allies are the first line of defense. The United States will support them, provide them money, equip them, fill in if they get overwhelmed in some way, but not be the primary forward posture day-to-day presence, right? That's a perfectly reasonable approach to supporting allies. It has not historically been the U.S. approach to supporting allies. The U.S. approach to been supporting allies has been a very different one, which is we go first. We support the allies by being out in front of them and preventing them from being the first line of defense. Instead, the United States is the first line of defense, and we're backstopped somehow by the allies, or the allies chip in by giving us access to a base or to an R&R zone or whatever it might be. But we're the primary fighters, and we're the primary day-to-day patrollers. And, I guess I would hope that in a posture review, even that's committed to a strategy that supports a strategy that's committed to alliances, that we could think about the effect of precision strike, or about the burden sharing issues within the alliances, and we could have a posture review or an implementation of a future strategy with a posture that made the allies the primary line of defense, since they are inherently forward relative to the United States, and that we were the backstop. And to me, that's it's the great unanswered question of the posture review, whether the United States thinks as its posture, we need to still be the first line of defense.
Thank you. Well, lots of things to pick up there. I actually want to start on a really kind of piece of the way they went about it, because they spent a lot of time, I think, as the administration saying this was about process for us, maybe as part of that climb down from the initially significant expectations that were raised for it. And something Mara Karlin, who was in charge of the strategy and rolling this out, has said is she raised this idea of integrated deterrence, and she broke that down into three things. And Stacey, you'll have seen that with her speaking earlier this week on CNAS. One of those was talking about whole of government. Now, I just would like you to unpack how significant that is. Is that a buzz phrase, or does it actually mean something? And Stacey, as you said, perhaps it's corrective from the time of the Trump era. Does it mean anything really going forward? This was a review that consulted USAID. Is that usual, unusual? Does it tell us anything about the way the administration is trying to approach its defense posture? Stacey, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think that integrated deterrence is clearly going to be the cornerstone of the next defense strategy, as Dr. Karlin stated. We've heard Secretary Austin develop the idea over time, though it's still a little bit sketchy because it is attempting to deter in all different domains across all levers of power at all times. And it does fit nicely within a priority of the Biden administration since they've taken office, which is that they're going to lead with diplomacy first, and that the Department of Defense is going to be supporting that. And that makes sense in why the State Department would be involved. I mean, all of these agreements are very political to host American forces. It's often a fairly contentious decision. I mean, that's true in the United States as well. There are a lot of equities involved in this. And so the State Department should be at the forefront in terms of negotiating, renegotiating, or changing any elements of the U.S.'s posture. That being said, the global posture review is specifically focused on and limited to the Defense Department. And they define it as the forces, the footprint, and the agreements overseas. So the agreements piece is the State Department's wheelhouse, but then you have the forces and the footprint, which the Department of Defense pays for and provides. So I don't think you would expect to see more whole of government in a global defense posture review. You have seen other countries that sometimes do this, like the Brits' recent defense white paper, I think, I might be misremembering exactly what it was called, talked about their diplomatic presence overseas as well, and some of the softer power elements that sometimes deploy abroad. But this was pretty clearly just focused on DoD, with the State Department leading in the diplomatic arena.
Can I throw that out to the other two of you, see if you want to pick that up?
But I think, I mean, to me, global posture is about the military and what the military is going to do, and the negotiations and notification of other countries. The diplomacy of it is a follow-on. It's not the driver, and shouldn't be the driver. But you know, the idea that as part of shifting to a more restrained form of a more restrained strategy, which would be a good idea. A lot of times people talk about the rising importance of diplomacy or other tools relative to military policy tools. And I guess I would hesitate personally to call this a whole of government approach, because, you know, kind of my view of interagency centralization is a little bit, I don't know, jaded, or I don't think a lot more interagency centralization is a good idea. But the idea that as a substitute form of American engagement with the world, or internationalism, if we were less militarized, that we might want to be more diplomatic, or, you know, like it would be nice to have consulates in parts of the world where we don't currently have consulates. Like that could be good for the United States. And if that's part of thinking about posture of the United States as opposed to posture of the Department of Defense, you know, that seems reasonable to me. But I just don't, you know, I think the fundamental thing is that the United States is over militarized, and a global posture review ought to be trying to cut that back. And then what the rest of the government does in response is a different matter.
To note, this document, of course, is actually classified. We've only seen a very short summary and seen a discussion of it. Do you think there's any more to it that we're not seeing, or that we're somehow missing the true meaning of it? And I suppose part of that is that the Defense Department did say it does expect to make announcements next year after it consults with allies and partners. Do you think there was anything, particularly after the summer they had, you know, they didn't roll it out in summer, they were a bit busy with Afghanistan then. There was also the upset of France after the announcement of the strategic pact with Australia and the UK. I mean, is there anything about the way they've rolled this out that really says more about attempting to manage alliances and make sure that they're the first ones to hear what is actually in the posture review, rather than the American public? Gil?
Yeah, I would hope that's the case. I mean, you kind of hit it on the nose there in terms of the reaction really just in the last few months between Afghanistan. And I think some of that, especially the Afghanistan case, is kind of disingenuous in terms of some of the carping you heard from European allies about consultation, and there's been back and forth on that. But it seems more salient, more real in the case of AUKUS, where I think the French were totally left out of the loop, and they're, you know, their own kind of unique kettle of fish in terms of their relations with the U.S. and with NATO and with Western allies in general. But certainly there was some kind of hurried and concentrated effort to kind of repair, you know, build bridges and repair that relationship in the wake of the AUKUS announcement. So could that have affected the rollout in terms of reorienting the administration on how they want to do this? Maybe. Is there more there? I would hope, if this truly was, and it took 9-10 months, if it truly was as holistic and as baseline and as kind of zero budgeting as it was claimed to be, and I don't know the really amount of manpower and man hours devoted to this review, but I would hope it really does. I think Eugene referenced this earlier, kind of go down the line and talk about, at least lay out even in a pretty concise form, why do we have installations X, Y, and Z? You know, I know that the accounting for how many total U.S. bases is kind of fraught, and it kind of depends on Some of that sometimes is those. I wouldn't take a lot of those numbers at face value, but everything from a lily pad that is a half dozen people coordinating with a local ally in a very remote part of West Africa, up to sprawling mini cities in Bavaria or Germany or other really large U.S. military footprints that have been there a long time and have a tremendous amount of infrastructure and logistical capacity. Why are these? What is our express purpose for having these? What do they facilitate? And I think you would find in a lot of cases, whether it's smaller CT stuff or back to old legacy Cold War infrastructure, I think there is still, despite regular reviews and despite DoD doing its churn, I think there is a lot of stuff that is inertia driven, that is there. We have things to support things because we've been doing it that way. And there may be a kind of relatively broad top line justification, but I would hope that's what's going on, I guess.
But Gil, what would you like to see them do differently then? If there are things to support things, what decision do you want them to make?
I think Stacy mentioned the Middle East, and I think we ought to have a long, hard look at why we're doing what we're doing in the Middle East. To me, keeping, especially if you accept the premise that we have limited resources and that China is the pacing challenge, and both previous and the current administration have been pretty explicit about that. If you're going to make cuts, and I wouldn't even accept the phrase "accept risk," because I don't think there's that much risk in a lot of these secondary or tertiary theaters. But certainly, I don't think we need to really have troops and have much of a posture in the Persian Gulf. I think we need to, if we're looking at oil as a strategic weapon and looking at safeguarding sea lines, we need to be outside and able. I mean, we really need to be the ones in the event of a serious crisis with China and in the other way, in terms of energy supplies to U.S. allies in Asia, which is where 2/3 of oil and gas in the Middle East is going now. We need to be the ones to be able to close or open the Strait of Hormuz, not to be bottled up in the Persian Gulf. So I think that entire kind of chain going from Bahrain into Kuwait, I think that needs a serious look. I know there's been some limited rebalancing toward Jordan, and potentially there may be more rebalancing away from our footprint in Turkey, and that's been a subject of discussion for a long time. So that would be a big one, and I'll set it aside for now. But Europe, to me, is another big question that we have not really answered or even grappled with for the most part.
Stacy, I want to come to you because Mara Khan said quite clearly that even with secondary theatres, as Gil referred to, and tertiary, there's a lot going on. And if we just look at the news today, there's a huge decision that the administration needs to make about exactly what support it does or doesn't give to Ukraine, to NATO allies along the eastern flank. You've got the talks with Iran. The administration is desperately trying to get those talks to go somewhere, but developing clearly other options at the same time. And General McKenzie, I spoke to yesterday, and he said we've got a very robust set of military options should we need them. So there isn't much sense of any kind of pullback at the moment from Europe or the Middle East at the same time that China is looming large. And Mara Khan said the spectrum of conflict is going to be keeping us pretty busy. Where can they make choices? And what do you make of those kind of decisions that they're facing?
That's a really good question, because it is challenging right now, given the array of challenges that face the United States and persistent threats that don't seem willing to sort of go away. But I do think the Middle East is a place where you can make changes. I'm not sure that our conventional forces that are stationed there right now are contributing that much to our diplomacy with Iran, nor are they really deterring much of anything. You see that a lot of the proxy attacks that Iranian forces in Iraq launch happen regularly, which suggests that deterrence has failed, that we were in a situation of compellence. And I don't really view the threat of Iran seizing the strait as being particularly imminent. And that is something that the United States could surge to manage. What I would like to see in the Middle East, and what some of my colleagues have argued in a recent report, is that they move to a more limited counterterrorism focused presence. And when we talk about changes, a lot of time we're talking about bases. And I don't know how much of a shift you're going to find in terms of the infrastructure. I see it as more of a forces demand that we would like to decline. Because the United States doesn't actually permanently station any of the forces in the Middle East. They're all rotated there. And that's actually incredibly taxing on the overall force structure because it typically takes 3 units to maintain 1 forward, which is pretty costly. And we've seen the drain that these constant operations has had on the Navy in particular, where their readiness has been a persistent challenge and the forces are just getting worn down. The ships are breaking more quickly. Sailors are being asked to go on incredibly long deployments. And I think that is unnecessary. What I'd like to see is that the Middle East shift to a counterterrorism posture that is a bit more akin to what the U.S. has in Africa, probably focused on unmanned aerial vehicles or drones that keep watch over the situation with Iran and on terrorist activity in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And then the United States, if needed, and if a crisis emerged, could surge forces forward for larger operations. But it would largely be one of monitoring and being watchful and prepared to act, but not doing so too hastily, because that can also be draining.
So with US troops right now, there are 2,500 in Iraq. The combat mission is coming to an end, but those troops are actually sort of, those numbers aren't expected to change. 900 in Syria. What would you like to see to happen to those?
I suspect that those forces are probably going to remain about the same because they are largely doing the advising and assisting mission of partners and allies on the ground. And I certainly don't want to see the United States having to intervene again like they did in 2014 when ISIS overran much of Iraq. That would be unfortunate. So helping to bolster those partners and allies seems sensible and a relatively efficient way. Those also aren't the forces that are really needed in other theaters at this moment. So that's a fairly modest commitment and footprint. I'm more concerned about the air and naval forces, which are needed, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, but also in Europe, the air forces in particular. We've had a huge number of not just fighter and bomber aircraft in the Middle East for many years now, but also tankers and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft. And these are assets that are incredibly valuable and are needed in other theaters to keep an eye on what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea, East China Sea, around Taiwan, also in Europe. And having them all concentrated there in the Middle East for a threat that the administration has made clear is a lesser threat, and one that the terrorism is not going to be the focus going forward, seems somewhat foolish.
Eugene, I'd like to come to you as an advocate of restraint. Can you talk a little bit about what you think is in store when it comes to China? I mean, obviously there weren't that many significant announcements, but at the same time, they've clearly said their priority is China, and we'd expect to see over the next year the administration kind of start to put meat on those bones. To what extent does American power still rest on the global military footprint, and how will people start understanding that in the context of China?
Well, I mean, I think American power, of course, rests on the American military and potentially where we project that power. Like, we have a military like no other in the world. I mean, we pretend that, you know, China is getting a serious military compared to the United States, but it's just not true, right? I mean, China is getting the capability to brush the United States back off the Chinese coast, which is real, and we should adapt to that. But you know, the day that China is talking about having serious deployments off the coast of California, then we could talk about whether China is, you know, on the military scale of the United States. It's just it's nowhere close. So yeah, of course, that's a core of American power. The question is, what should we do with it? I think the administration, from what they say, from the sound like the talk about the alliance or the concert of democracies going on, the clear hostility they've painted, you China is the core of the bad guys, the authoritarian, authoritarians are bad, democracies are good, we're going to fight on the side of democracies. Like, we're gearing up. The rhetoric seems like the administration is committed to the, they don't like the phrase, but to the new Cold War, right? Like, they are ready to have a long-term confrontation with China. And some people think it should be more military, and some people think it should be more whole of government, or however you want to phrase it. But, what do I think is happening with respect to China is that we're preparing to treat them like the Soviet Union, except more dangerous. Whether they actually are more dangerous or not is, again, a debatable point. But the direction we're headed is not the direction. I mean, I don't think it's a necessary direction. We could choose to do it. It would be risky. It would be expensive. It would be, it would be bad policy. But we could move in the direction of choosing to have a new Cold War. But I don't think there's a need. I don't think there's a need for that. I'm not. We could have a conversation about strategy, but that's a sort of a different conversation from the conversation about posture.
Well, Stacy, I know you disagree, and please, I'll step out. You two hash it out between yourselves.
Thanks. No, I mean, I think that you have to look much more closely at what sort of capabilities China is acquiring and what that prevents the United States from doing than just comparing their forces one for one. The Soviet Union never had as expeditionary of a force as the United States does today, and yet it certainly was a challenge because we were committed to defending Western Europe. Similarly, today, the United States has explicit security commitments to Japan and the Philippines, and China, and less formal sort of agreement with Taiwan. Yes, South Korea, but not as worried about China with South Korea. But and what you find is that China actually has stated ambitions and claims some territories that the others either also claim or that they are theirs. So there is clearly concern about territorial aggression. And the point is that China doesn't need the same number of aircraft carriers to threaten the United States. It has developed a military strategy and capabilities that are intended to stop the United States from being able to defend these allies and partners, and that tries to go at critical nodes in how the U.S. fights, and one of those is its posture.
Yeah, and if I can take kind of a bit of a middle road here, I'm more or less in the camp of people that think the China challenge, and it seems to me this is sort of where the administration sits, as best as we can divine that. That the challenge from China to the United States is primarily economic, informational, espionage, a host of non-military, non-kinetic tools are really where we're most vulnerable to China eroding U.S. advantages and potentially long-term impacting American prosperity and actual American security, if not physical American security. I mean, I think geography kind of prevents that, as Eugene kind of alluded to. But I worry that we're on a trajectory to be in kind of the worst of both worlds, where there is rhetoric and sort of posturing and kind of silly stuff. Like, I think if I'm following this correctly, we withdrew our diplomats from attending the Olympics after the Chinese had already said they didn't want any foreign diplomats coming. So that kind of symbolic stuff, and at the same time, our military posture is eroding. And I think Stacy's absolutely right. Something she said at the outset here, that one of the things that concerns me about a little bit of the global posture review that's been released publicly. We're in a very different world in terms of, because of precision strike capabilities, because of the reach and accuracy of missiles. We are used to doing business maybe everywhere except in Europe at the height of the Cold War decades ago, with sort of a Iron Mountain kind of logistical footprint and having the luxury of building up. Desert Storm 30 years ago was probably the best example of that. But even these two past small wars of kind of mature theaters, we're used to being able to build up in sort of this permissive environment of being able to move things around and posture, put the pieces on the chessboard. and then go to war at a time and place of our choosing. And should something happen, even something short of a full-blown war, let's say there's a conflict over Taiwan and the U.S. Decides to stay out, but is still, under the threat of Chinese missile strikes. So I think that the U.S. posture in the Pacific, we should be looking at survivability, at sort of what happens after the dust clears from any kind of initial encounter. Even if you think the military instrument is the last one we should be using to check Chinese ambitions that do affect the United States, I think we're in a dangerous place now, where we're operating under sort of a lot of old assumptions, and we have a footprint that, in the event of stumbling into a war, is really dangerous. I think that some of the stuff I've heard and coming out of certain corners of the Defense Department, out of CAPE maybe, and out of net assessment, in terms of maybe the United States needs to seriously rethink this idea of operating in close to China in the event of a conflict, and rethink about where can we be safe from in the age of missile warfare. And that's a conversation about Guam, about Hawaii, and about a much longer, kind of slower, deliberate approach to a major war, which is not. We have a lot of thinking, I think, predicated on information dominance, on delivery of firepower very quickly and at a lot of volume, and quick decision. And I question how realistic that assumption is going forward.
Eugene, your face says you need to say something.
Well, I mean, I don't know what I need to say. I mean, we obviously have just we can have a conversation about strategy, and we have different views about strategy. I mean, so yeah, the Chinese have developed a set of systems and deployments that make it harder or riskier or more expensive for the U.S. to intervene in a conflict on behalf of our allies. And if we're committed to those allies, like, of course, our strategy change, we can change our relationship to our allies. I mean, that's part of what a strategy is about. But I think our allies are generally good folks, and we should support them. But the question is, how to support them. And what China has developed is a bunch of weapons and techniques that make it harder for us to support them the way we traditionally have, which is by planning to launch punishment attacks against China. Like, the United States' basic operational concept throughout the world is, if we're mad at someone, we want the ability to strike any country anytime we feel like it and make them sorry that they crossed us. And having that kind of offensive operational concept in certain parts of the world is harder than it used to be. In many parts of the world, it's not. The United States can meddle freely and, bomb people. We can fly drones in the Middle East, relatively unimpeded. We can't fly drones over China unimpeded. But we now can't, send airstrikes over China unimpeded, or fly or attack China with missiles unimpeded. But that doesn't mean that China has a tremendous capability to attack Japan or Taiwan, right? The systems that they would need to develop, the training that they would need, the operational concepts that they would need to go on the offense are different than the ones that brush us back and make it hard for us to counter intervene. And we can also take advantage of the kinds of things that make it hard for us to intervene on the offense against China, to make it hard for China to intervene on the offense against current U.S. allies, right? So, like, everything that makes it hard for the United States to go there also makes it hard for China to go to Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, to take your pick of who you think the United States should be willing to go to the mat for and, risk a major war over. Like, that's, kind of what we're talking about here. And, just the idea that, some kind of major mobilization or posture shift by the United States needs to happen to prepare, because, we can't afford to move the Iron Mountain and choose our preferred time and place of intervening now in the new world. So we need to be ready in advance, up front, ready to react to anything, just doesn't strike me as true, right? We want to put the strategic challenge and the operational challenge onto the adversary instead of taking it onto ourselves, right? So if technology makes it hard to intervene in places that are not contiguous to your country, well, that's a problem for China, not a problem for the United States, because we, at least in principle, don't want to intervene in other countries that are not contiguous. We don't want to intervene in countries that are contiguous to us, or at least we say that we don't want to. And if what we're worried about is China doing that, and we think that's getting hard, that's good news, not bad news.
Yeah, but I think that the distances are very different, right? I mean, I'm not a die in a ditch for Taiwan kind of guy. I'm not in that camp, but that's what, 65, 70 miles at the narrowest point from China's shores. That's a very different proposition than the U.S. operating in China's backyard. And I completely take your point, Eugene. And in a lot of
what
ways,
are the Chinese going to do? Swim for it? Like,
I
come
think
on.
I don't know if we have time to unpack
it's not that short.
It's a challenge, and it's something. And this is a country that hasn't fought a war in a long time and hasn't won a war in a long time. I wouldn't discount any of that, but it's a vastly different proposition than it was even 10, let alone 20 years ago. Leaving aside Taiwan, it does come down fundamentally, and you touched on it at the beginning. If we look at just our actual treaty allies, we look at the Australians, Japanese, the Filipinos, and Korea. Are we willing to fight a war on their behalf? And we are committed to that right now. And I think there are good reasons for those alliances, especially, Japan foremost and Australia close behind. I think those alliances are much more valuable, much more important to the United States than all of NATO, to be totally frank. So that's a first order question. It's maybe a little beyond the scope of what we're talking about today, but.
Stacey, I want to ask you to pick up on what Gil mentioned in terms of where exactly these, if you take the administration aims in its own terms, where you should be putting your posture, given the kind of concerns that Gil raised about precision strikes. So Dr. Carlin announcing the posture review said, more broadly across the Indo-Pacific, you'll see a range of infrastructure improvements in Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands and Australia. Those will include things like, more broadly, logistics facilities, fuel storage, munition storage, airfield upgrades. Are they putting things in places that are going to get taken out anyway, if ever anyone wanted to use them?
I think those are actually some of the right locations. And I don't see the department moving to forward base permanently more forces really anywhere right now. What they need to do is take a combination of measures, which includes improving the resiliency of our existing bases. China has the ability to reach the United States today with ICBMs. We all saw the orbital bombardment system test, which I wouldn't overreact to because they already have the ability to hit the US, but they are developing longer range dual use capabilities like the DF-26, which can range Guam. And, Hawaii is not going to be far behind. So we can't run away from this problem. We actually are a Pacific power. And what needs to be done is taking steps to disperse forces. So the Air Force and the Marines are all developing operational concepts where they operate from many locations instead of one big base that's close in, say the air base on Okinawa right now, Kadena. And so acquiring access and making improvements in infrastructure to those facilities and then exercising that should strengthen deterrence and be crisis stabilizing. Because right now, China has a lot of long-range capabilities that can reach out and coerce our allies and partners. They are also developing an invasion force. If you look at the recent China military report, their Navy is larger than ours now. They are explicitly developing amphibious capabilities, and I don't pretend that is an easy type of operation or something that would be undertaken lightly or necessarily immediately. They're building an invasion force, and that seems to be what they're aiming for. So just because there is water, it is not necessarily an impenetrable boundary for them.
It's impenetrable for us, but not for them. So you're right. They have ships that if we just let them sail up to Japan or Taiwan would allow them to land troops in Japan or Taiwan, and they're going to build more. But, I don't think the Japanese and the Taiwanese are just going to let them do that. And the same kinds of systems that make it hard for the United States to approach the Chinese coast on a wartime footing make it hard for the Chinese to approach any coast of a friend of the United States. And by the way, the kinds of systems that we say are hard for the United States to approach the Chinese coast are much more defensible systems, much harder to target than the amphibious ships, which you would need to launch the kind of invasion that you're talking about. Of realistically, we're talking about Taiwan here. Like, they don't get a free pass. It's not they beat the hell out of us, but we just can't do anything to them.
I agree, but 500 nautical miles is pretty different than several thousand from the west coast of the United States, and in fact, significantly different. And our allies and partners today don't have the same sort of anti-access area denial capabilities that China does. So they don't have the means at this point to make it as difficult as they should. To defend themselves.
More, but they have, it's not that they don't have these systems. Like the Taiwanese produce a pretty good anti-ship missile. The Japanese are deploying anti-ship missiles currently in the Ryukyus. Like, it's not like these are impossible tasks for these countries. They should do more. Great, I'm all in favor. I would even, rather help pay for them to do more than buy another aircraft carrier for the United States. I'd rather do neither. I'd rather these are rich, technologically sophisticated countries that can build their own defense postures. But if, they need Uncle Sam's checkbook to help them do it, we got a lot of money. So, we should spend our money more wisely. But they should have the first line of defense. And they can have the first line of defense, right? That's the thing. 90 miles of water is still a bunch of water to cross in the face of defenses, anti-ship missiles, mines, take your pick, whatever you want.
Eugene, we're running out of time, so I want to give everyone a chance just to say one thing before we wrap up. I want to throw one more spanner in the works, which is that the nuclear posture review, if the FT reporting by my esteemed colleague Dimitri Sevastopoulou is correct, the White House is actually discussing that today. That is expected out next month. All of that also obviously has a bearing on how the US is thinking about China and whether it is or isn't giving extra clarity on whether the US would ever resort to nuclear weapons and in future, and under what circumstances. So, Eugene, can I give you a quick minute to wrap up how you see the Biden approach to the US posture around the world and what it is and isn't getting right in your view?
Well, I mean, all we have is these little bits of tea leaves and rhetoric and our knowledge that, the Biden administration is committed to drawing a strong contrast to the Trump administration with respect to alliances and democracy, right? So I think the Biden administration is moving. The tea leaves suggest to me the Biden administration is moving in the direction of a new Cold War. They want arms control as part of the new Cold War. So the nuclear posture review will be interesting because of what it says about arms control potentially. But we'll see. But I just think we're moving in a direction of very engaged, forward, militarized, and whole of government posture built on the idea democracy is good, authoritarian regimes bad, and we must confront them aggressively. I think that's bad policy.
Okay, Eugene, I'm going to stop you there to hand over to Stacy. The new Cold War, is that the right analysis on this?
I don't know if that's the right comparison, though there certainly are some similarities. On one point, I do agree with Eugene, and that's that the Biden administration, we need to wait and see what comes out of their strategy review, which is going to include the nuclear posture review. And I would argue that they need to take steps to strengthen conventional and strategic deterrence. And one of those is improving the resiliency of their posture in the Pacific.
And last word to Gil.
Yeah, just coming back around to where we started and where we were a minute ago. I think that the big square in the circle piece, and I don't know if this administration can do it, is putting more, walking that line, that very fine line between putting more on our allies' shoulders, as Eugene referred to, while keeping, I think in some ways, the constant invocations of credibility are sort of the last resort of the national security scoundrel, but keeping the U.S. engaged and keeping the U.S. there as the balancer and as the ultimate force of last resort, specific to the Pacific. And as Stacy spoke about distributing and sort of survivability, the bare minimum as an opening kind of change we need is countries like Japan, Australia to a lesser degree, allowing U.S. forces to disperse, to use civilian airfields, to be much more survivable by having a much more dispersed footprint in the event of even just an escalation of tensions with China. But more broadly, I mean, let's look at Taiwan. They're spending not even half, closer to a third of what they spent 30 years ago on their own defense. And that's not, I don't think it's a sustainable situation. I think the United States cannot do it for them, especially Taiwan, which is not a treaty ally. So we have to find a way to get our allies to do more while still taking a realistic look at what the U.S. military presence should be and what we would do in the event of a conflict, as much as we're trying to prevent that.
And with that last word, raising the spectre of more to do on burden sharing, I'd like to thank Gil, Eugene, and Stacy very much for joining today, everyone who listened in. And we'll obviously be looking out for what the Biden administration commits to and says next year. Thank you.
Thank you all.